there's a larger spiritual and energetic component to this that we definitely do not understand. But it's interesting because you just mentioned that these kind of individuals are calling for the same thing throughout many different years and many different decades. I absolutely agree with you. What are they calling for exactly? How would you explain that to the kind of normie Kyle and Karen out there? What are they calling for? What's their goal?
I think the elite ideology nowadays is wedded to a form of extreme Darwinism, where there's a social Darwinian attitude that if you are in power, you have the right to be in power. And that goes along with the belief that actually goes back to Plato in the Republic, that the human population has to be kept at a certain level for the ideal balance. Plato's whole system was based on Pythagoras's number mysticism. And so there's a lot of hoodoo in that, but what today's elite have borrowed or taken from Plato is the idea of dialectics. And part of dialectics is that you have to do evil and good at the same time. Yeah,
he also believed in problem reaction solution. That's where a lot of the larger kind of implementation of a lot of the programs that they do.
Plato thinks that society should be controlled by a secret society that lies to the public. It's called the noble lie, and it's a loose kind of technocratic model. Even though they didn't know about technology per se and the way that we do. In Plato's Republic, you have discussions of techne, which is the same idea. And the whole idea is that society should be run like a giant math program. And so Plato said the philosopher king goes and studies on a mountain for 30 years and learns math, and then he comes back and he impresses upon the city, on the society, the mathematical geometrical principles of an ideal state. That's what the Republic is. And then in later books, he says that actually it should just be run by an oligarchy that is a secret society, right? Wow. So, yeah, and they have to lie to the public. And Plato was famous for eugenics, for this idea of keeping the population at a very sustainable level. And he even says that not to feed the plebes meat. They got to eat rice. They got to eat kibble.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, I heard that before.
Yeah.
That's Bill Gates' major pledge.
Wow.
And what they've been talking about at Davos. Continue. Go.
We got to get the numbers down. Everybody's got to be eating some kibble.
Kibble.
Pretty much. That's what they have us eating, dog food.
Hold on. Dog food is meat.
No, not the Chinese-made stuff. There's a whole...
Okay, well, hold on. I don't know what dog food you're getting for Atlas.
No, I'm not getting the Chinese-made
That's
stuff.
right. Good dog food is meat.
A lot after World War II, they created dry animal food, dog and cat food. It used to be all meat, and then they're like, we need the meat for the troops, so let's create some new pharma thing, biopharma. I don't know what is in this bread that they're giving to cats. What do you think? Your cat's not supposed to be fat. It's fat because it's eating bread.
And cats can't digest that stuff. They're carnivores.
Feed your animals meat.
Well, have you tried Beyond Kibble? I've got a new company called Beyond Kibble.
So I used to. Plato's like one of my idols, but I just don't know a lot about him.
Well, there's good and bad in Plato.
Why would you have an idol that you don't know much about?
Yo, he thought Klaus Schwab was a nice guy. Come on.
I mean, I've always looked up to the idea of Plato because of platonic love, things like that. Like this concept that you can have brotherly love with humans is strictly platonic, apparently. So he's done a lot of good, but apparently, platonic. And I love the idea of him sitting with Socrates, who's tripping out, just saying the most crazy stuff, and he's writing it down. Like, yo, this world's gonna remember this dude.
So would you say like Plato is like the founding father of the Illuminati?
Yeah, ultimately. That's a good way to put it.
You're talking about that Jay-Z thing? That music group?
No, like the Illuminati is like a vague, generalized term to talk about a lot of the powerful people that kind of rule things in secret. It's been popularized by people like Tupac, who've talked about it and made songs about it, but it's just kind of a name for the people behind the scenes.
Well, funny you said that, because the origin of the phrase Illuminati, which comes out of the French Revolution.
The illuminated ones.
It's the illuminated ones, and I've just been reading this history of Byzantium, and the Cambridge guys talking about how when Platonism made a resurgence in Byzantium, right when Byzantium was about to fall, they were called the illuminated ones, the Illuminati, in Byzantium, the radical they were atheist Platonists, and then they influenced the socialists of the French Revolution, the Jacobins, who were the Illuminati, historically speaking.
Is this like the Hermetic Society too? Does that all come from?
Some of them were, yeah. So Plethon was the Byzantine Platonist who was a Hermeticist, yeah.
And so it comes up to flash forward to the future, 1884, Fabian Society. Who's the Fabian Society, and how are they involved?
So this is created by the Rhodes Milner circles, namely the Royal Society. It's one of the offshoots of that. Cecil Rhodes was the Diamond and De Beers magnate, working together with other elite banking families, right? And they sort of set up a model for control that was modeled on the British East India Company. Cecil's thing was diamonds, but that gave him the idea from secret societies like Freemasonry to create his own society called the Society of the Elect. And the plan was originally to bring America back under the British Empire. They didn't really succeed at that, but what they did do was make alliances with the wealthiest families in the U.S., who were all, namely David Rockefeller, for example, who were not just influenced by von Hayek and Austrian economics. David was actually really influenced by the Harvard socialist Harold Lasky. And that's what got him into Fabianism. And that's why Rockefeller, for example, was a big fan of Mao. Like he wrote editorials in 1979 in the New York Times saying that Mao's experiment was this great thing. So the wealthiest people that you could think of in America, J.P. Morgan Chase, right, they're all funding and supporting socialism. Even Brzezinski in Between Two Ages cites Anthony Sutton, who's Anthony Sutton's famous, the professor who wrote the book, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, and Hitler in Wall Street, talking about how the elites funded these groups, right, and especially the Bolsheviks and the communists.
And the Chinese specifically, with the Chinese Revolution, that was a major component of the Rockefeller family that
Correct.
loved everything they were doing. The whole Cultural Revolution, they were loving seeing all that. The one-child policy, again, spurred on by a lot of these larger eugenicists that are using China as their larger playing ground, testing out all this latest and greatest social credit score, technological enslavement of human beings. And a lot of people believe China is separate and a threat, when in reality, China has been taken over by a lot of the Western elites that are using it as a model for the world. As Klaus Schwab says, China is the world that we want to be envisioned.
The model, yeah.
Sorry, I cut you off because I just had a thought that I just
so the Fabians are really just the ideologues who took Marxism and wanted to reform it. And their ideology was better. It was more successful, more useful than classical Marxism, because they were like, oh, the proletariat will rise up, and then proletariat just cares about going to lunch and eating their lunch pail, right? They're not interested in Marxist theory, right? So what the Fabians realized was that if we combine the Marxist revolution with big money, we could have a lot more effect. And that's precisely what they did. And so Beatrice Sidney Webb, George Bernard Shaw, they actually got to be really good buddies with a lot of the American industrialists and elites, and they influenced them, including Henry Ford, to begin to forms of socialism. And so that's why the whole push for the last century is this sort of technocratic socialist model.
So can we just do the same thing, but like in the other way? Can we get some prominent libertarian-minded individuals to come together to form a secret society that bestows liberty and shatters the shackles, and you know what I mean? Like they did it. Can't we be like, me and Luke go meet and we'll be like, how can we influence people to believe in freedom? I guess we're doing it right now. So. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, you guys inducted me when I got here, right?
There
was an eyes wide shut ritual downstairs.
Yeah, he had to swear an allegiance to being a personal responsibility, freedom and liberty.
So when they
meritocracy,
and I had to hit 3-pointers down there, so I didn't realize it was a basketball court.
Mm-hmm. He did.
When they started the Federal Reserve in 1913, it seems like this is part of the movement to bring the Americans back under the British Empire.
Absolutely.
So,
and they did, huh?
And they did it with the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. So they're going through Swiss banks. So is the British Empire intricately woven with the Swiss banks now? With a lot of the stuff, Davos is in Switzerland, the Bank for International Settlements, which is the central bank of central banks. It's the Federal Reserve of New York, the Bank of England, the Bank of Australia, all go through the Bank for International Settlements in Switzerland.
Yeah. Absolutely.
How tight is this?
That was even though that was a post-war creation, the BIS, they created it post-war to be that neutral kind of central bank of central banks, like you said. And it's modeled exactly the same way as the U.S. Federal Reserve is modeled, which is itself modeled on the Bank of England. So it was all modeled in regard to the Milner-Fabian circles, who instructed their dude, Colonel Edwin Mandell House, who was the handler for Woodrow Wilson. So that's why all of this gets pushed under Woodrow Wilson. So the League of Nations was created to be that first attempt at global government under the Wilson administration, right? They were pushing that then. It failed. And so they needed another world war, and then that led to United Nations, and it's the exact same people that set that up. But it's set up by the same people setting up the BIS.
Yeah, and the land that was donated for the United Nations was donated by David Rockefeller, who, of course, played a very key role in setting up this kind of international institution that would bring all the governments together in order to set some kind of soft form of world government. And when you look at the United Nations, the way it was built, a lot of the kind of weird kind of occult stuff inside of it. It goes along with the same kind of larger principles and ideologies that a lot of these kind of Satanists also kind of profess and express.
What caused the League of Nations to fail?
It didn't have any military prowess, and it was at that time they weren't able to convince Americans to go along with it. So actually, Congress didn't go along with Woodrow Wilson's internationalism that he was pushing, but they did get the bank pushed at that time, right? So it took several more decades to get the U.S. to go along with this stuff, and that's the key role that a lot of the British intelligence assets played, including Ian Fleming of James Bond fame. So William Stevenson of Canada, who was British intelligence in Canada, he had an office in Rockefeller Plaza. Noel Coward, the author, you probably heard of him, and Ian Fleming were able to convince the U.S. to set up its secret security establishment in 1942, and they put Bill Donovan as head of that. That becomes eventually the CIA, right? So that's that secret establishment. It's really just a private army of the Rockefellers is what it amounts to.
Do you think, this is a bit more anecdotal, but do you think that there were like greater global powers that pushed Germany into World War II and Hitler was kind of like a useful idiot? Or did he actually seize control and just go rogue?
No, I think that he was funded by these families, and that if you read, there's a whole chapter that Quigley covers. It's called the appeasement plan. So the British had a dual policy where on the one hand they were secretly supporting Hitler because they wanted the war, but then they were publicly opposing him. And that's because, as Quigley says, and actually the dude from Stratford agrees with this, the whole 20th century was to exhaust and get rid of the Anglo-American establishment's two main rivals, Russia and Austro-Hungarian Empire. The 20th century does that particularly. So the first two world wars get rid of that. Cold War basically depletes and gets rid of Russia. That was that key role that Brzezinski played in getting Russia bogged down in the Afghanistan conflict, and then they lose the Cold War.
Oh, and then when
a lot of people need to understand too that the United States was very pro-Nazi and pro-Hitler. I shouldn't say the entirety of the country, but
many of the elites.
He was Time Man of the Year.
Yeah, the Bushes.
Yep.
Prescott Bush, who was a senator at the time, was actually trialed for supporting the Nazis. There was also huge stadiums in Madison Square Garden where they had full-on Nazi rallies that were filled to capacity.
Crazy.
There was a lot of very powerful individuals that were bankrolling them, financing them. Many powerful corporations, corporations like Coca-Cola, IBM, and of course, a lot of the bigger influence from Hitler came from a lot of the eugenics Rockefeller-funded medical studies and boards that, of course, he paid for and financed, that essentially created the theory that Hitler was going on with his larger genocide and eugenics program.
Look at this. These photos. This is from NPR. This is crazy stuff.
Yeah, that's Madison Square Garden.
Madison Square Garden, Nazi rally in, was it 1939?
Yeah, Henry Ford was also another big supporter.
When did World War II start? It was
1939.
Right. That's crazy.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, all the banks were like, wait, we got to stop. We can't support this.
In 1938, Hitler was Time Person of the Year.
Yeah, he was on Time Magazine. Time Magazine was run by Henry Luce, who was Skull and Bones.
I went to an antique store, a couple of them, in West Virginia, because there's tons. People love antiquing out here. And I was able to buy hundreds of Life magazine going all the way back. I think I have the first issue, actually, which was like a couple $100. I was really excited to get it. And we're going to be putting at the new studio like a viewing library where you can go back and read all of the contextual perspectives. It is crazy to read about World War II before they knew what was going on. Nuts. In one of the magazines, they're like, the U.S. sent defensive machinery and equipment to the UK to prevent an invasion, and it basically shows the armaments for D-Day. Like, we now know the U.S. was sending weapons so they could storm the beaches of Normandy. Back then, it was reported that they were just defending the UK.
Oh, you mean the news was lying to people for military gain? Really?
Well, I mean, look, I don't expect them to be like, we're going to invade.
Yeah, of course,
you know what I mean?
The whole thing was a subterfuge played on the Germans, essentially, so they didn't know when they were coming or where they were coming from.
It really is. These magazines are incredible. To like read history in the perspective of the day with no foreknowledge, having the gift of hindsight to read like It's just a crazy thing to read a journalist be so wrong about everything.
It's part of why we need to preserve our data and why censorship is dangerous and why we need like external sources of data collection, because we need like our data should be in orbit in glass in case a meteor annihilates the surface, so that we can see what the mistakes we made along the way and all the things like what you're talking about, how we manipulated our enemies in the past, how they can be manipulating us right now. Mm-hmm. Do you think that when the Soviet Union was falling apart with this concerted effort to make the Russians and the Austrian-Hungarian Empire disappear, because I think when they split up the Soviet Union, the oligarchs or whoever split it up gave the Black Sea to Ukraine. They took it away from Russia. They didn't want them to have Mediterranean access. So you think that was intentional?
Oh, absolutely. That's a classic strategic area, Ukraine is, right? So Hitler had that as a really important area when he was trying to, go against Russia. But the Cold War, in my view, was a managed dialectic. Ultimately, I mean, not saying it didn't. I mean, my uncle was like a Air Force guy in the Cold War, so I'm not saying that people didn't do stuff, but at a higher level, these are the people who wanted there to be a dialectic between Eastern capital or Western capitalism and Eastern Soviet bloc communism to smash the two together. And what you get out of that is what's called a third way synthesis. And even back in the day, in like the 30s, Bertrand Russell was writing in Scientific Outlook as a high level elite planner at the Royal Society. He was writing and saying that he says, quote, "The experiment in Russia under Stalin is going great." And you'll find them talking about, David Rockefeller talks about Mao's, experiment. These are experiments, I think, of technologies of governance. They want to see how they work. I think Nazism was the same thing. And so they find what works well in what regions. That's why the West is still promoting, Azov Battalion and that stuff in Ukraine now, right? I thought we were supposed to be against Nazis, right? America, right? But in the Ukraine, it's cool. I mean, it makes no sense, right? But it makes sense from a geopolitical strategic standpoint. So absolutely, like the point was to destroy Russia, ultimately for integrating everything into a technocratic order. That was the plan 100 years ago. What we're seeing now. So yeah,
I guess it sounds like it was the plan 2,000 years ago with Plato, or at least he was giving the philosophy. The plan hadn't.
Yeah, I think Plato thought that you could have a city state. But I don't know if he thought like the whole world would conform to this. Maybe he thought that. I think later Platonists, like in the Middle Ages, thought we could take that model and it actually should be the whole world. I mean, you even see this in Enlightenment philosophers, like Kant has a whole thing about how to create a world government. So
thanks for watching this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. Hang out with us live Monday through Friday at 8 p.m. and become a member over at timcast.com for uncensored, members-only shows exclusive. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.